Well, we're on to the fifth video now, and we still haven't really done any editing to speak of, so if we want to keep calling this thing an editor, we should probably do some editing. Um, and in this video we're going to look at the three basic types of manipulations that you can do on items, and they are translation, rotation, and scaling. When it comes to creating new items, adding new things to the scene like new bodies and new fixtures and so on, each type of item has slight differences, so we'll look at them separately after this, but for now we'll just go with the easiest ones. And all of these things, let me just remind you again, we have this context help panel that we can open up, and this will tell you basically a whole bunch of the things that I'm about to cover right now. But just remember, if you're just getting started or if you forget what keys to use and so on, you can have this panel open while you're doing stuff, and it's quite helpful. So for example, if I select a body here, now the panel will tell me what I can do with this body. So you can see here we're going to look at these ones here to start with: translate, rotate, scale. So this key will tell you how you can start doing these. So I'll just close this up because better use of space, and I'll be telling you that anyway. So translation, you can start with the T key or the G key, which is how Blender does it. So if you're coming here from Blender usage, you might find that a little bit more convenient. So anyway, to start moving something, we just have the mouse anywhere, doesn't matter where it is, hit the T key, and then this item that we've selected, or whatever we have selected, will stick to the mouse, and we can hit escape to cancel that, or we can use the left mouse button to set the new position. So this is the way Blender does things, and to be honest, I really didn't like this when I first came across it, and it's probably a major sticking point for people that come to this style of movement from other software programs. I think the more typical case is that to move something, you would move your mouse onto it, probably hold the left mouse button down and then move it across like that. But after you've got used to the way we're doing it here, it is actually quite a bit more efficient, and there's a few extra things that you can do. For example, while I'm translating, I don't actually have to hold my finger on the mouse at all, which is quite nice if you're using trackpads and laptops and so on. And I can use the mouse wheel a lot easier to zoom. I can use the right mouse button a lot easier to pan. I can do zooming in and so on, things like that. So anyway, it's once you get used to it, it's quite an efficient way of working. So that's basic translation. Use a left click to set the new position. A few other things we can do is, while we are translating, if we hit the X or the Y keys, this is X, we can restrict the movement to the X axis. And if I hit X again here, it will just release that restriction. And if I hit Y, then the restriction becomes the vertical axis. And I can switch between those restrictions like this, or hit the same key again to just release that restriction. What else can we do? Let's see. While we are moving, we can hold down the Shift key to make the movements much smaller. So this just reduces the movement by a scale of 10. So it makes the movements 10 times smaller. Like this. Shift down, Shift up. And we can also hold down the Control key, and what that does is it makes the movement jump in units of 0.1 instead of smooth movement. So this is moving 0.1 units to the right at the time, and when we do this, we can use the status bar at the bottom of the window here telling us how far we've moved. If you look at this while you're moving, you can move something exactly, for example, exactly 1 unit to the right. Like that can be quite handy sometimes. Okay, so that's Shift, Control. What else do we have? Well, that's the main translation operations right there. I've been moving just a couple of bodies here, but you'll find that for most of the other item types, for example fixtures, if I select this fixture, same keys, same movement, shift, control, everything works pretty much the same. Images move around like that. There is just one thing that is a little bit different, and that is joints. So we'll look at joints, and we'll look at some joints over here. And what have we got here? Let's pick on this joint. And this joint, we have two bodies, obviously, the car body and the first part of the antenna body there. And when we move joints, the thing to note is that a joint actually has two locations. There are two anchor points related to it. So when we start translating this joint, the first time we hit the T key, we start moving the local anchor A for the joint. So that's the point that is attached to the car body, in this case with the green dashed lines. And then if we hit the T key again, we switch to moving the local anchor B, and we can just keep hitting the T key or G key like this, and just move the mouse around like this to check which one you're moving, and you should be able to tell from the location of the dashed lines which anchor point you're moving right now. So that's the main difference with joints. There's 2 points, and we'll cover joints, each joint type, in more detail later on. But there are some joints for which there's actually a third sub mode that exists when you're doing translation. And distance joint, this is a distance joint here, and this happens to be one that has a third mode, which is, as we'll see, we hit T once and we're moving the local anchor A. One more time we're moving the local anchor B, and then a third time we'll see that we can actually set the distance for this joint, the length rather, for this distance joint. And so this is 3 modes. If we keep hitting the T key, we cycle between 3 modes instead of 2. So some joints are a little bit more specific. They have extra things that you can do. Okay, and finally, one more thing that's quite handy to know about translation, is if we have more than one view. Let's see, put this over here and make this go at the top. What you can actually do, I'll go back to bodies mode here, and I'll put all of these windows in bodies mode because this is the way this works. For example, if I'm moving something here in the bottom right view, and the mouse goes into another view, that translation gets carried across to the other view, and you can see a preview in all of the windows for this scene because they're all looking at exactly the same data, and when I change anything in one of them, it will be changed in all of them. So this can be quite handy if you're, for example, let's say this car was actually a huge game level, and you have something over here in the left side, and you want to sort of copy this scene across to the right hand side or something. You could then set up 2 views like this so that you can simultaneously look at the big picture and a close-up view of each position. So say we want to move this little player to the front of the car, we can do that quite easily by translating across like this, and you can see in the view above it seems like it's jumping from one spot to another. So that's quite a handy way if we wanted to, say, copy this across there. Now we have the same thing in each place. And you can do that for rotation and scaling as well, but it's mostly useful for translation. So I'll just put everything back how it was. And okay, now let's look at rotation. That's it. Okay, so rotation, the basic way that you start and stop rotating is the same thing. You hit the R key, R for rotation obviously, and when we do that, basically it's the same thing as for translation. We move into this mode and we don't need to hold the mouse button down, we just move the mouse at this point, and the thing that we are rotating kind of sticks to the mouse. We can move the mouse cursor around a little bit to give ourselves quicker rotation. Let's try this, quicker rotation like that. Or if we move it outwards, we can get finer rotation, more precision in our rotation movements. And as we can see here, I'm actually rotating around the 0 point in the world. That's just because that happens to be where the cursor is at the moment. So I'll bring the cursor up here. I'll put it, say, there. Then we can zoom in here again. So if I try that again, we'll see that now I'm rotating around that point where the cursor is. And if I hit the R key again, I will switch to rotating around the selection center, which is the little white cross here in the middle of the bodies. So hitting R again and again will switch between these two, cursor and selection center modes. So if you didn't watch the earlier video where we talked about the selection center, that's just this white cross, which is, for example, if we have a body out here, a body over here, if I select this body as well, we'll see the white cross moves over here. So it's just kind of like the center or the average position of all these bodies. And this is quite handy if you want to rotate things but not really move them too much. You can rotate around the center like that. Rotating around the cursor is quite handy. For example, if you want to pick a specific position in space, so let's say we have the top corner of this player body here and we select that and do CS to move the cursor to the selection. Then we can go back to bodies mode and we can rotate around that point in space. And once again we can use shift to give ourselves 1/10 the amount of rotation to give us finer control, and we can use control, hold down the control key, and as you can see in the bottom status bar, this is jumping now between angles in steps of 5 degrees like that. So that makes it pretty easy to do things like, say, if I want to rotate this exactly 90 degrees, I can do that quite easily. And you can also change the current selection, the rotation center that you're using. For example, now we're using cursor, and you can see that changing in the toolbar here, and you can change that by selecting the toolbar, but most of the time it's a lot easier just to use the R key, and you can just wiggle the mouse around a bit like that and it's quite obvious to see whether you're using the cursor or the rotation center, the selection center. Okay, that's rotation, and rotation of course works the same for all the other types of items, so we can rotate fixtures and joints and vertices and everything. If we have some vertices here and we rotate those around the selection center, we'll see something like this, or around the cursor, something like this, and it's all pretty much the same as for translation. Okay, right, finally we have scaling, and scaling also has this concept of a center point. So if I just go back to bodies for a second, get rid of this body, and I'm just going to bring this body out here, and I want to make it a little bit more, make it a little bit more asymmetric, so that we can see what happens when we scale this in a negative direction. So we have this body here, and we are going to scale this body. So once again, we have this cursor here, and I'll just put the cursor over there. And when we scale, right now we're scaling around the selection center, so this is handy for scaling, but if you don't want to move it too much. And by hitting S again, so S is to start scaling, we can scale, and this time the center point is around the cursor. So just by hitting S again, we can do the two different types of scaling. And as for rotation, we can put the cursor position somewhere. Say if I put it there, we can, back to bodies mode, we can scale around that point. So this is quite handy if we have a certain point on the thing that we're scaling that we don't want to move, as is usually the case if you have some fixtures and you're trying to fit an image to the fixtures. For example, let's look at this image here. We can scale this image, and right now we still have the cursor up there, so we're scaling relative to that point. But let's say we have this image here, and we've just dropped this image into the scene, and we're trying to match it up to the car body. It can be quite handy to find one point on the image that you can match easily. So for example, let's match up this point here, which we can see is that corner of the car. So I've matched this up, and then I'll just put the cursor there. So now when I scale this image, I'm going to be scaling it, and this point will not move. So we can scale up like that, and makes it quite easy to get things in the right place. So yeah, scaling works for bodies, fixtures and images and vertices, but it does not work for joints. It doesn't really make all that much sense to scale joints. So joints, if you try and scale them, nothing will happen there. Okay, so let's look at mirroring using scaling. So we can do that for bodies and fixtures and joints. We can't mirror images, but you can use the properties of an image here to you can flip an image by using this property here. So we don't mirror images that way, and when you're scaling, I should also mention that, of course, when you're scaling something like this, you can use the Shift key to get finer precision, or you can use the Control key. And if you look at the bottom in the status bar there, we are scaling in steps of 0.1. So that makes it easy to scale something down by half or double the size quite easily. And if you don't like the units that we're using there, in the options dialog you can change those here. So we have the step size that we're using for translation, rotation and scaling. You can set those to be something else if you prefer. Alright, so scaling, we can also do the X and Y restriction that we did for translating. So let's look at that. So we're scaling around the cursor here, and if I hit the X key while I'm doing this, we can see that the Y values, the vertical dimensions, are not changing. And we can actually bring this across to the other side of our scaling center point, and that gives us the effect of effectively mirroring the things that we're scaling. And if I hold down the control key here, I can get an exact mirror here. So the scale factor is -1, and if I click the left mouse button to confirm that, then I have mirrored that body. So it makes it pretty easy to make duplicates of things. So I can duplicate and then scale that across there, and now I have two bodies which are exact mirror of each other. And you can do that in the Y as well. So scaling the Y flips things upside down, and this will work for bodies and fixtures. Oh, and vertices. Let me just check that. Yes, vertices should be able to do that as well. Yep. Okay, so that's bodies, fixtures, and vertices you can do that for. So finally, one thing to note, or a couple of things to note about that, is when you use this negative scaling to make a mirror image of something, you might have noticed that we get slightly different polygon decompositions, and that's because the winding order of the vertices in the fixtures gets reversed when you flip it across the axis by doing a negative scaling. So just to take a look at that again, we had scaling in the X dimension, and we only have two sub-polygons to start with here, so there's a thin line here. You should be able to see that, I think, in the YouTube video still, and that's breaking this concave polygon down into two parts. And when you flip that across to make a negative version of it, you'll see that the polygon decomposition is not quite as good, and that's just a side effect of having the vertices in a clockwise winding instead of the optimal counterclockwise winding. So one way to fix that is you can select this fixture. So I am in fixture edit mode now. If I select the fixture, and then I can use this reverse vertex winding, but we'll cover that a little bit further when we actually come to editing fixtures, so don't worry too much about that now. And one other thing just before we finish to be aware of when you mirror bodies like this, particularly bodies that have joints attached to them like this one here. We have one joint there and two wheel joints that are part of this car body. So we're just going to mirror this whole structure by selecting all of these bodies, and I'll put the cursor point here in front of the car, and then I'll hit X to scale this, and we'll scale it across here, and I'll hold down the control key to make sure we get it exactly -1 scaling. That's going to flip the image, unfortunately. We can fix that with a flip and rotate it 180 degrees. Now, what I wanted to illustrate here is that in some cases, for some joints, this mirroring doesn't work perfectly. So if we have a look at the joints here, we'll see that the positions of all the joints have been mirrored just fine. But there are 3 joint types for which you may have to go around and readjust their settings after you do this kind of mirroring action, because the 3 joints are revolute joints like this that have limit settings. So we'll get into joints a bit later, but these little spindly lines here show us the limits for this revolute joint, and after you flip revolute joints you might have to readjust those settings. And the other thing is for joints that have a axis, so that's prismatic joints and wheel joints. It depends which direction the axis is facing. So in this case we have the axis facing perfectly straight up and down. So when we flip this across the y-axis, as we just did, it doesn't change anything about this joint axis. So in this case it's fine, but if this joint axis had been sort of sloped diagonally, we would probably have to come back to this joint and adjust the joint axis later on. So just a couple of things to note there when you're mirroring bodies like this. The bodies themselves will be fine and the locations of the joints will be fine, but you might have to readjust some of the limit settings after you've done the scaling. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video, and coming up next we will look at the individual item types, bodies and fixtures and so on, and how we can add new ones to the scene. So I'll see you in the next video.